Hey, all, Brian here. So I'm going to read chapter 23 of my book, Warrior Priest of Dmon-li, of my epic fantasy series, the Morcyth Saga. It's early in the morning, guys. I'll do the best I can. I got family here. Yeah, I'm falling behind on these. Usually I do this the night before. Anyway, all right. Chapter 23, I'll talk more about it at the end. Back to the edge of the tree line, they moved out into the grasslands in order to make better time. They hugged the trees as they moved north through the hills. The mountains grew large ahead, and after an hour of riding, they reached their base. Skirting around the tall mountains, they stayed in the foothills as they continued north. The hours passed as they followed the mountains on their left. Moving along the foothills was fairly easy. The waning moon gave them ample light with which to see. An hour or two before the approach of dawn, they rounded a hill and came upon a camp of enemy soldiers. In their haste, they failed to take notice of the enemy camp before one of their sentries saw their approach and called out. When they failed to answer, the soldier fired a crossbow bolt and sounded the alarm, alerting those within the camp to their presence. The bolt flew past Jiron just as he brought his horse to a quick stop. Turning their horses quickly around, they fled to the south just as a horn sounded from the camp. Far to the south ahead of them, several horns answered. "Damn!" cursed Jiron as he turned them eastward, riding fast away from the two forces. Horns blared behind them as they called to each other. In the moonlight, enemy riders were seen racing out of the camp in pursuit. One sounded a horn when he caught sight of them fleeing across the grasslands, letting the entire countryside know their whereabouts. It wasn't long before horns were heard coming from ahead of them to the east as well. Having little choice, they turned to the north to avoid those ahead and rode hard as they tried to outdistance their pursuers. "James, can you do something?" Jiron hollered. "I can't see them," he replied. "I can't be sure of being effective until I know just how many are back there and exactly where they are." "How long until dawn?" Fifer asked. "An hour," guessed Jiron. "Maybe more." Another round from the horns behind them sounded in the night. "We've got to silence those horns," Fifer yelled. If we don't, the armors ahead of us will know we're coming, and there goes our chance of sneaking through." "How many do you think are behind us?" asked James. "There were about 20 at the camp we almost ran into," Jiron explained. "Add to that the other two groups, maybe 100 more." "I can't take out that many," James exclaimed. "Not in the dark anyway. I can't be sure to even get them." As they continued to fly across the plains, a kernel of an idea began to form. He hated doing it to the horses, but he had little choice. Concentrating hard, he created a patchwork of holes behind them in the ground. Each was 7 inches in diameter and a foot deep. Any horse putting its leg in one would have it broken, especially at the speed they were going. He created his orb so the riders behind would know in which direction to follow. Now, in my mind, when I was writing this, see, I was a Pizza Hut, a manager at Pizza Hut, but before I wrote this. And when you do the dough, you have the perforator that you roll across. It's got the little spiky things, and it creates the perforation so that when the dough cooks, the yeast and gases come out, so it doesn't bubble. That's all was in my head when James was doing this. It's like taking a massively large one and rolling it across the ground, creating all these holes. "What are you doing?" cried Jiron. "We're trying to lose them, not attract them. I want them to follow right behind us," he explained. Voice strained from the effort to simultaneously talk and create the holes behind them all at the same time. It was taking far more out of him to create the patchwork of holes than he'd expected, and it didn't take that long before he began beginning to develop the beginnings of one whopper of a headache. Suddenly, behind them, a horse screamed out in pain, then several more. "What's happening?" asked Fifer as they slowed to a fraction. As they slowed, I'm thinking, "Sounds like the horses are in distress," Jiron said as he glanced behind them. More and more horses cried out as they stepped into the holes. After several minutes of creating holes, James stopped and they rode on at a reduced pace for a few minutes. The horns behind them quieted and the sound of pursuit fell off. I think I slowed them down a bit, he said. From the sound of his voice, the others could tell that bit of magic had taken its toll. Sounds like it, Miko agreed. They rode on for another half hour before the sky to the east began to lighten. Glancing behind him as the light increased, James was relieved to see no signs of their pursuers. The mountains fell off behind them as the range moved more to the west. To the north, a large body of foot soldiers appeared far in the distance, moving to the northeast. Jiron brought them to a halt, then turned around, moving southwest to avoid them. Soon, the army vanished in the distance. Now, while I was reading this, yesterday, because I always read them first, make corrections, because they have a whole lot of things that need to be corrected, and then when I read them here, these mountains, moving around these mountains. Now, I spent the last 25 years before I moved here in Seattle, so I had the Rockies, the Cascades, and then the Rockies, and these are massive mountain ranges, right? And so I always thought that they went a little bit too fast around these mountain ranges. But then I moved to Oklahoma, and in western Oklahoma, off of I-44, there's a place called Lawton, and right off of that is the Wichita Mountains. Now they call them mountains, but anyone who grew up in Colorado, Wyoming, or the Northwest would not call them mountains, but they call them mountains. So these mountains are like the Wichita Mountains. They're not like the Cascade Mountains, the big massive mountain range. Yeah. So I'll throw that out there. Because the Wichita Mountains is more like hills with one or two tall ones, and these tall ones would be foothills back in Seattle. Foothills, yeah. Smoke off to the west rose from a large structure sitting along the base of the mountains. That army must have come through here, Jiron surmised. Think they left anyone? Asked James. Why? Asked Fifer. If they didn't, it might be a good place to hide until night, he explained. Why would they go back if everyone there was dead? Good point. But they might also be using it for a forward staging area, Jiron suggested. Pointing in that direction, he said, look, you can see people moving around that structure. Straining to see, James nodded as he made out several moving about. He said, you're right, better not chance it. Several miles further north was another line of trees. Indicating them, Jiron said, maybe we could make it there before anyone detects us. Maybe, replied James as he sat there and thought a moment. We got to go somewhere, Michael said in exasperation. We're kind of exposed sitting here. To the trees then, decided James, and everyone nodded agreement. They turned the horses north and broke into a gallop. To the east, they saw the tail end of the marching column in the distance, but held to their course. It was a very tense time as they made for the trees. James expected to hear horns from all directions when they were discovered. But as luck would have it, they reached the trees without being spotted. Or if they had, whoever saw them took them for their own. After all, they were behind the enemy's lines. They moved deep within the forest and continued their northward trek. The sun climbed in the sky as they forged through the forest, not making near the speed they had out on the plains, but were definitely less likely to be discovered. Deeper into the forest, they came across a small river as it flowed southward. Tired and exhausted, they stopped at a clearing to rest. Breaking out their food, they had a quick meal before continuing on. How much farther do you think before we reach their lines? James asked Fifer. We're already past where they were when we went south after Lord Pytharian, he replied. No telling how far they pushed north since then. Lithila is only a day or so to the north. I would think that's where we'll find the bulk of their army. That one we saw moving around the forest, Jiron asked. Do you think they could have been on their way there? Likely, said Fifer, but who knows for sure. Once they were done eating and the horses had a rest, they remounted and resumed moving north to the forest. They decided not to follow the river northwest. Instead, they headed due north, hoping to avoid anyone that might be using it. The day progressed as they continued through the woods. Sometime after noon, they heard a rustling ahead of them. Suddenly, 4 men with longbows stepped out of the trees, arrows nocked and ready. Several other armed men stepped out with them. One came forward and said, "Stop and identify yourselves." "Are you Maddox's men?" James asked. Nodding, the man waited for the reply. Fifer stepped forward and said, "My name is Fifer. I belong to Miller's band." Indicating the others, he said, "These are friends." The man eyed him suspiciously. "Don't know any Miller's band, and you're not familiar. What business have you here?" Fifer glanced at James and Jiron before replying. "We helped rescue Lord Pytharian from the Empire, got separated from him, and now we're trying to get back to friendly territory." The man signaled the archers, who lowered their bows. "Heard he disappeared." Nodding, Fifer continued. "He was taken in a raid. I believe there was treachery involved. We separated several nights ago. He went north while we diverted a force bent on capturing him to allow him time to get through to our side. Last we saw, he was headed in this direction." "You'll have to come back with us to our camp," the man explained. "Our captain will want to hear what you have to say." Fifer glanced at James and Jiron, who both nodded. He turned back to the man and said, "Lead on." Well, at least they encountered folks from Matic, Empire would have been a whole other story. I guess the reason why he's willing to believe them is because they look like they come from the north. If they had been of Empire stock, he probably would have killed them on sight. The man turned to one of his men and whispered a moment. His man then turned and ran northward, soon disappearing into the trees. "My name's Erwin," he told them. "Don't be alarmed." He just went ahead to let them know we're coming. James stepped up and offered his hand. When Erwin took it, he said, "I'm James, and this here is Jiron and Miko." Each gave Erwin a nod when they were introduced. Erwin led them through the forest, his men flanking them as well as bringing up the rear. "The camp's not too far away, about a mile or so," he explained. They walked the rest of the way in silence. Soon, a camp appeared among the trees. From the looks of it, several hundred men called this camp home. As they approached, they saw a man in woodsman attire standing at the edge of the camp waiting for them. He was flanked by several men, bodyguards by the looks of them. "That's Captain Alarin. He's in charge of these woods." "Captain," he said when they came near, "these are Fifer, James, Jiron, and Miko. They claim to have helped Lord Pytharian escape from the Empire." The captain's eyebrows rose slightly when he heard that. "Great news indeed, but where is Lord Pytharian?" James stepped forward and replied, "We were separated from him several days ago. We drew off a group of soldiers in order for him to escape. Last we knew, he was headed in this direction." "He hasn't passed through these woods, or I would know it," stated Captain Alarin gravely. "He may have gone around them and found a safe route that way." He gestured for them to follow as he moved to a large tent. Coming to it, one of his men opened the tent flap. After the captain had passed within, the man continued holding the flap open as the others filed inside behind him. Within the tent were tables covered with maps, as well as braziers burning throughout to give light. The captain moved to one with the large map lying open and gestured for them to join him. He indicated a section of the map and said, This is the forest where we are. Where was the last place you saw him?" James came over and inspected the map. He saw near the bottom area where the mines were. "Here," he said as he pointed to a spot a little west of the mines. Then he brought his fingers to the town just west of the spot. "This is where they had taken him." "And you rescued him there?" he asked incredulously. "Just the four of you?" "Actually," Fifer said, "I wasn't with him at the time of the rescue. I was waiting outside the east gate with Miller and the rest." He glanced at James, Jiron, and Miko a moment, then shook his head. "That hardly seems likely." "Likely or not," Fifer replied, "they did enter the city, and they brought him out." "Do you have a mirror?" asked James suddenly. "Or perhaps a bowl of water?" "Why?" "I will be able to ascertain his whereabouts if you do." Fifer saw the captain's confused look and explained, "He's a mage." Eyes widening, Captain Alarin said, "Truly?" When Fifer nodded affirmative, he said, "Never met one before." "Do you have a mirror?" James asked again. Captain Alarin reached over to another table and lifted up some papers, revealing a 4-inch square mirror. Picking up, he handed it to James. "Will this do?" "That will do just fine," he replied as he took it. Setting it on the table in front of him, he motioned for the captain to stand next to him. Concentrating on Lord Pytharian, he let the magic flow and the image began to form. Suddenly coming into focus, they saw Lord Pytharian in a room with others, talking. "Ah," Captain Alarin said as he saw the image. A smile appeared. Hang on. "What?" He's made it to Colton, he explained. When he saw their lack of understanding, he continued. It's a town to the north and is still within Matic territory. The ones with him are leaders of the town, as well as a few others I don't recognize. Could they be members of the Alliance? Asked Fifer. Perhaps, he replied. It's been a while since I've been out of these woods. Is Colton well fortified? Asked Jiron suddenly. Could it withstand an attack? Shaking his head, he said, hardly. It's not that big of a town. If anyone were to attack, it wouldn't be long. It wouldn't be able to last very long. Why? We saw a large force of foot soldiers moving around this forest, explained James, indicating their position on the map. If those soldiers were to surround and hit Colton, would they be able to hold them off? Looking worried, Captain Ellerin said, not a chance. It would fall in a day. Moving to the tent entrance, he hollered for one of his men. When the man came close, he said, send word to Colton. Warn of immediate attack by a large band of men moving from the east around the forest. Wait, he heard James say. When he glanced back, James said, there may be a quicker way. Have someone stand by, he told the man who ran off to carry out his orders. He turned and came back over to James. How? I'm not sure if this will work, but I might be able to give him a message, James explained. Looking skeptical, Captain Ellerin said, all right, let's see if it works. First, let me see where exactly the army is now, he said as the image shifted. The image scrolled eastward. When it reached the edge of the forest, James moved it first southward, and when he failed to find the enemy, he moved it north. There, Captain Ellerin exclaimed when the enemy afoot appeared in the mirror. Do you know where that is? It's near the northern edge of the forest, he explained. It's several hours away from Colton. All right, James said as he concentrated. Again, the mirror refocused on Lord Pytherian, and they heard him mumble. Now, to get his attention. We've got to get word to the others in the Alliance that I'm back, Lord Pytherian said to the others. We must remain united if we're to stop the Empire. How long do you suppose the rest of Matic would last if we failed here? Suddenly, one of the men in the room gasped. There on the table before Lord Pytherian sat a round, glowing orb. Astonished cries erupted throughout the room. Lord Pytherian raised his alarms and shouted, Quiet! The room grew silent as he stared at the orb. Something seemed strangely familiar about it. James, he whispered in sudden understanding. He glanced around the room expecting to see him. For those who don't know, I do some minor editing while I'm doing these readings. The orb suddenly winked out, eliciting another round of murmuring. Where the orb had sat, there appeared a black mark. Lord Pytherian again called for silence as he leaned closer to see what was happening. The black mark began moving until it formed the letter T. Odd, he watched as the black mark continued writing. When it finished, he read aloud what it had wrote. There's an army 3 hours to the south, headed for you. I advise you leave. He nodded, turned to the others and said, Gentlemen, it's time to evacuate Colton. Head pounding, gasping from the effort, James almost swooned into unconsciousness. The effort to write that message had been harder than he had thought. Must have been the distance. He held the image until he saw Lord Pytherian nod and begin barking out orders. Now, in my later books, James wants to contact people, but he can't because it's just too far away. Because, doing magic over a distance, it's like James is here. And if he wants to do a magic effect, the further out the radius goes, the more magic it needs to do it. And every little thing he does takes it starts going exponentially. And when it gets too far, he just can't do it. So, but Colton wasn't too far away, so he was able to do it in this instance. When the image finally disappeared, Captain Ellerin asked, Do you think he understood? He nodded, so I believe he did, James replied. Good, he exclaimed. He abruptly turned and left the tent. Outside, he hollered to one of his aides. Get the men ready to march. The man saluted and began making the preparation. What do you plan to do? Asked James from the tent entrance. Harass that army. Slow it if I can, he replied. Give Lord Pytherian and the people in Colton a chance to flee before it arrives. He looked at them and continued. Could use your help. A mage will come in handy. Shaking his head, James replied, "We need to hurry north. Stay ahead of the army as best we can." "I understand," he replied. He called over one of his men. "Doran here will lead you through the forest to the north." He glanced at Doran, who nodded in understanding. "Now, we must hurry to catch this force before it draws closer to Colton." James looked out at hundreds of men standing ready, each armed with a longbow. "Good luck," he said to Captain Aileron. "You too, James," he replied. Then to his men he said, "Move out." He and his men melted into the forest and in no time were gone. "Grab your horses," Doran said as he walked over and mounted the only horse left in the camp. It's not far to the northern edge. It's not far to the northern edge of the forest, but we should hurry. They mounted and followed Doran as he led them through the forest. The trail he took wasn't very noticeable, and unlikely that they would have been able to follow it on their own. Without Doran's help, it would have taken them twice as long to cover the same distance. An hour later, the trees thinned as they reached the northern edge of the forest. Doran stopped them abruptly and signaled for quiet. He pointed off to the east where the leading edge of the army, heading for Colton, could just be seen. They waited there a moment, then horns began to sound, and they watched as the army suddenly turned and moved back the way they had come. "The captain, just let him have it," Doran exclaimed jubilantly. He turned back to the others, pointing to the north, and said, "Colton lies a little over an hour north of here. Be careful. The Empire has patrols moving all along this area." "We will," James assured him. Offering his hand, he said, "Thank you for your help." Taking the hand, he gave it a shake and said, "Glad to be of service." Turning his horse back the way they had come, he kicked it in the sides and he bolted away, soon disappearing among the trees. Looking out past the trees, they saw the open plains once again. The distant sounds of fighting could be heard coming from where Captain Aileron was attacking. "Almost there," said James as he glanced at Jiron. "Never thought we'd make it this far." "We're not there yet," Michael added. "Come on," Fifer urged. "This is not the time to be sitting and talking." Kicking the sides of his horse, he broke into a gallop as he left the shelter of the trees. The others got their horses moving and caught up with him. "Which way?" asked James when he came abreast of him. "There should be a road just ahead of us that runs east and west," he explained. It lies on that road from where another from the north intersects it." Hang on a second. "Colton lies on that road where another from the north intersects it." "Riders!" Michael yelled. Scanning the horizon, James saw a group coming toward them from the northeast. "Are they Fermatic?" he hollered to Fifer. "Can't tell," he said, squinting in an attempt to see better. "Should we wait?" asked Jiron as he watched the 8 riders approaching quickly. A moment later, Fifer exclaimed, "No, they're the Empire's men." "Damn," swore Jiron as they turned to the west and rode hard to keep ahead of them. Riding fast, they maintained their lead, but weren't successful in widening it. "A road!" Michael cried as it appeared. "Which way to Colton?" James asked Fifer. "Left or right?" Pointing east, he replied, "That way, I think." If they took the road east, the riders behind them would easily move and close with them. Giving up on that idea, they turned and headed west. As they raced westward, a river came into view. A large army stood on this side of the river, facing the west. Facing west. Easily 1,000 men strong, they stood before a bridge spanning the river. On the other side was another army, one from the Empire. Horns sounded from both sides as the Empire's troops moved forward to claim the bridge. A hail of arrows flew from the defenders. They slowed their horses. James glanced back at the riders behind him. When the riders saw the army ahead of them, they came to a stop, then quickly turned around. No longer threatened from behind, they paused and took in the situation at the bridge. Bolts and arrows flew from one side to the other, bringing men down. The crossbowmen of the Empire outnumbered their counterparts to devastating effect. Half of them appeared to be targeting Maddox bowmen, while the others were being more selective, helping to clear the bridge so their footmen could advance across. "I don't think they're going to keep them on the other side of the river for long," Jiron said. "They should have destroyed that bridge," Jiron added. "Probably didn't have the equipment nor time before they showed up," reasoned Fifer. He glanced at James and asked, "Can you do it?" "Probably, but that would kill everyone from both sides who are on it," he replied. From the rear section of the defending army, they saw men pointing to where they watched the battle. A squad detached and made its way toward them. Recognize any of them? Fifer asked, or James asked Fifer. Shaking his head, Fifer replied, "No, I don't think so." Sighing, James said, "Let's go meet them and hope they won't immediately attack." He took the lead with Fifer next to him as they moved forward. The leader of the approaching group came close and then raised a hand, indicating they should stop. "What's your business here?" "Busy?" James asked as the sound of fighting by the river intensified. The amount of arrows striking the attackers were beginning to decrease as the Empire's crossbowmen continued taking out Maddox's archers. "Sort of," the man replied. "Now, what are you doing here?" "We're here to help," Fifer explained, causing the man to gaze in his direction. "Help?" the man laughed. "How can you possibly help?" "If that bridge was gone," Fifer asked as he pointed over to it, "would they be able to cross?" Shaking his head, the man replied, "They'd not be able to ford the river. They'd have to travel several more miles downstream before they could cross." He gave them a closer inspection and continued, "But I don't see how that can happen." Fifer glanced at James, who resignedly nodded and said, "You get us close and we'll take it out." He pointed back to the bridge and said, "Look, they're almost on this side. We would have pulled out long ago, but we got word that they're evacuating Colton and needed time to get everyone out." "Nevertheless," James told him, "you get me close and that bridge is history." "Do you even need to be close?" asked Jiron. Looking surprised, like the thought had never occurred to him, he gave him a weary grin and replied, "I guess not, but the closer I am, the easier it will be." "Then let's move closer," Jiron said as he started past the squad of men. James followed, and the squad joined them as they moved toward the river. When they reached the rear guard of the defenders, a place where the bolts of the Empire couldn't reach, he stopped. "Now what?" asked the squad leader. "Just wait," said Jiron with a smile, "and watch." The squad leader looked at James as he closed his eyes. A cry erupted back at the bridge. He turned his attention to the river and saw that the attackers had reached this side. A cry erupted back at the bridge. The attackers had reached this side, and more were pouring across. The defenders were being mowed down by the bolts sailing through the air and the swords of the men. What was left of the order and discipline the defenders had was gone as they turned. What was left of the order and discipline of the defenders rapidly deteriorated as they turned and fled the battlefield. Crumph! Suddenly the bridge exploded. A mass of men and stones sailed through the air before landing among the soldiers on both sides. The fighting halted momentarily as both sides stared in startled shock at what remained of the bridge. Then, the defenders, who had been in complete panicked rout, erupted in a cheer as they saw the enemy's route cut off. The once routed defenders turned on the enemy who'd made it to this side and attacked with renewed determination. Jiron looked at James and was glad to find him not slumped over or passed out as he usually did after such a display. The squad next to them stared at James in awe, and Jiron could hear "a mage" being whispered among them. Eyes still closed, James again concentrated. Crump, crump, crump. 3 consecutive explosions on the far side of the river ripped through the ranks of crossbowmen, and their deadly hail of bolts come to a stop. This time he did begin to slump. The past days of hard riding and little sleep had taken its toll. Orders to fall back were heard from the other side of the river, and the defending army began to retreat. An officer rode over to them. The squad leader saluted as he approached. "What the hell happened?" the officer demanded. The squad leader pointed to James, who sat crooked in the saddle, and replied, "He just showed up, sir, and, well, he blew the bridge. He's a mage." "A mage? And he just happened by when we needed one the most?" the officer asked. "Yes, sir," the squad leader replied. Another rider came up and saluted the officer as he reported, The enemy is falling back, sir. They're regrouping west of the river and aren't showing any signs of leaving." "Pull our men back from the river and have them rest," he ordered. "With the bridge gone, there's no reason for all the men to stay here. Send half to Colton to aid in the evacuation. I'll stay here with the rest and keep an eye on our friends over there." "Yes, sir," the rider said as he saluted and turned back to the man as he carried out his commander's orders. "You might want to keep all your men here, sir," Fifer said to him. "Why?" replied the commander as he turned to join them. "And just who are you?"
'Fifer, sir. I'm with Miller's band."
"Miller, you say?" "Yes, sir. We were part of the Alliance forces near Lithilla when Lord Pytherian was taken. Understanding suddenly dawned on him, and he stated, "So, you are those men?" "Sir," asked Fifer, "aren't you the ones who helped Lord Pytherian escape from the enemy?" "Well, yes, sir." "He said you might be coming through the lines," he replied. "Also said to aid you in any way I could." Breaking into a laugh, he said, "Though it seems it turned out the other way around." "Sir," a man said from behind him. Turning around, he asked, "Yes?" "All the wounded have been loaded onto wagons and are making for Colton." "Good," replied the commander. "Send an escort." Saluting, the man turned and arranged for the escort. "Now, why should I keep the men here?" "To the south is a force coming around the forest where Captain Aileron is defending," Fifer explained. "He is currently harassing them, delaying their march, but they should be here soon." Nodding, he signaled another soldier who came over. "Send a rider to Captain Aileron. Tell him the bridge has been taken out and the enemy would likely be coming his way. We won't be able to send reinforcements. He's to hold his position at his discretion." Saluting, the soldier said, "Yes, sir." As the soldier moved to carry out his order, the commander turned back to them and said, "The main battle will be for Lithilla. The men will be needed there. That's our first priority." "Sir," a soldier hollered as he pointed across the river. "The enemy is pulling out and moving south." Looking across the river, they saw the army heading south, keeping just out of range of Maddox bowmen. "Captain Aileron is soon going to have his hands full." "Looks like it," James said. "What do you plan to do?" "Follow them as they go south," he explained, "at least until they reach the forest. Then they're Aileron's problem." He turned and signaled another of his aides and said, "Get the men ready to move. We have to keep them on that side of the river." The man saluted and began barking orders as he got the men ready to march. A soldier brought up the commander's horse. Mounting, he turned to James and said, "When you see Lord Pytherian, tell him Commander Ethan will hold the southern flank for as long as possible. I'll keep the bastards off them as they march to Lithilla." "Good luck, Commander," James said. "Good luck, Commander," James said. "You too, son," replied Commander Ethan. "Ride fast. The Empire has patrols on this side of the river, but no main force north of here. So far, we've kept them on the west side of the river, but that's not going to last for long." "Move out," he hollered to his men as they began pacing the enemy soldiers. James and the others watched as the commander and his men moved south, keeping the enemy from crossing over. Then they turned their horses north and followed the river. They didn't get very far before they heard horns coming from the east. Answering horns sounded from the army across the river. From the east marched the army that Captain Aileron had been trying to slow down. "They're going to catch Commander Ethan and his men against the river," he exclaimed. "They'll be cut to bits," cried out Fifer. They watched as the army moved toward the Maddox defenders. Commander Ethan formed his men to meet the charge, but from where James was sitting, it didn't look like he stood a chance of surviving it. The army across the river had stopped the southern advance and placed crossbowmen along the edge of the river where they fired a volley. The bolts fell short, but if Commander Ethan was pressed backward much more, they would soon be in range. "We've got to help them," Fifer said to James. "They're dead if we don't." Jiron watched as James tied himself to the saddle as he had done several times before. That could only mean that what he had in mind was going to be rough. "Stay close to James," he told the other two. "We've got to protect him and get him out of here once he's done." They moved toward the advancing force. At first, they were not noticed. So intent was the army on the trapped men against the river. When they got within a mile, a force of 20 broke off and headed in their direction. James glanced at Jiron and said, "I'm already very tired." "I know," he replied. "Do what you have to. We'll get you out." Nodding, James tightened the rope binding him to his saddle before closing his eyes. Crumph! The ground under the men exploded in the biggest explosion James had done so far. When the dust cleared, none of the attackers were moving. Fifer gasped as 5 translucent floating balls appeared before James. As if propelled by a strong wind, they flew toward the Empire's men. Barely seen, they reached the army and began moving among them before they were even noticed. Arrows from Commander Ethan's men rained upon the attackers as they came within range. Their longbows had a much greater range and force than the counterparts' crossbows. As the enemy noticed the orbs moving among them, they began stirring and edged away from them as best they could. Unfortunately, the tightly packed formation didn't allow them room enough to avoid them. Suddenly, the enemy force was lit up as red lines flared between the orbs. The men cried out in fear, all thoughts of attack forgotten. One soldier tried to flee, and actually ran into one of the lines. After he crossed the line, he stumbled for a moment, and then the top portion of his body slid off the lower. The red line had cut him in two. Unable to move, caught within the boundaries of the lines, the bulk of the army came to a standstill. The arrows from Commander Ethan's men took a terrible toll on the stationary man. As the translucent balls moved, hang on a second. So too did the lines. Jiron watched in fascination as two lines came together and the men trapped between were agonizingly cut in half before his eyes. James slumped over his horse as he tried to hold onto consciousness long enough to complete what he had planned to do. He gave one last surge of power as he brought the balls together in the middle of the group of men. Every last one was cut in half. The cries abruptly ceased. Then he passed out and the balls disappeared. A cheer went up from Captain Ethan's men as they surged forward to attack the remaining enemy soldiers who hadn't been caught within James's line of death. Arrows fell as they rushed forward to close with them. The enemy turned tail and retreated, but was soon overtaken by 100 horsemen that struck them down. Some stood and fought, but didn't last long. Jiron saw the commander wave. He waved back and then said, "Let's go. We've got to get him someplace safe for a while." "What's wrong with him?" asked Fifer as he looked worriedly to the unconscious James. "It's what happens when he does too much magic," he explained. "If he uses too much, he passes out, and then it takes some time before he can even do the simplest things again." "Oh." They moved down the road and quickly caught up with the wagons bearing the wounded and the men escorting them. "How far to Colton?" Jiron asked one of the soldiers. "About an hour," he replied. "It's not too far." "Thanks," he said as they pulled away, leaving the wounded behind. So that ends chapter 24. Now, a lot of things happen in this one. They basically have made it through the lines. They did some battles. Now, the whole translucent balls and the red lines things, okay, I think that came from the movie Ghost Ship. I don't know if you guys have seen that. Excuse me one second. But in the opening scene, there's on the ship, before it becomes a ghost ship, there's a party and they're all dancing on the deck, right? Well, the bad guys trip this wire and it cuts through everyone on the dance floor, severing them in half. I think that was in my head when I was doing this scene. Now, for those who have read the Morcyth Saga, they know that James never did this again. Why wouldn't he? James is conflicted in the use of magic. There's good magic and there's evil magic. This one here, to him, felt evil. He had to do it, and he couldn't have seen any other way to save Commander Ethan's men. But to him, it was wrong to do it, and so certain magics, he, in gameplay, reading books and things, he knows that the more you rely on doing the worst possible thing, the more likely you're going to do the worst possible thing, and the worst possible thing, that line will go further, and you'll be doing worse. And before you know it, evil's taken over you. Going to the dark side, so to speak. So he tries not to do that. I instilled in James a serious moral code, and I've tried to adhere to that throughout the series. I get dinged a lot for that, but that's just the way it is. And it's one of the checks and balances. It also might be why everyone likes this series so much, because James is a good guy. He does terrible things, but he doesn't do it without a reason, and it's usually to save someone's life, right? Like if someone broke into my house, I would shoot them. But to shoot them outside my house for no reason, that would be an evil act. But defending my family, while the act itself is bad, allowing them to hurt my family would be worse. And that's what James goes through. Okay, now to other news, non-book related. My brother's here for the week. My daughter and her new husband, my new son-in-law, will be here today as well. He's a good guy. I like him. And so I'm not sure how much I'm gonna get done today. And while he's here, I'm doing my best to get these chapters out and have them ready at 6 a.m. every day. But if 6 a.m. comes and goes and one doesn't come out, that's because situation has developed where I've had no time to do it. So between now and probably next Wednesday, it's gonna be hit or miss. After that, I'll be on track. But we're 23, so it's like what, a week maybe, and before we'll be done with Warrior Priest of Dmon-li. Then we'll go to Trail of the Gods. Now I like Trail of the Gods because, spoiler if you haven't read it, Trail of the Gods is where James sits down and starts researching magic, starts doing more creative things with magic. So he won't just pass out every time he does magic. See, the first 3 books, James was pushed. He had no time to rest. You know, events just propelled him along. But in Trail of the Gods, he starts out and he's on the ranch, and he's there doing magical research. Anyway, I think that's all I had to say. Y'all take care. Like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. I really appreciate it. Oh, yeah, I've been giving updates as far as my YouTube channel. So yesterday, I got 4 more subscribers. So the number of subscribers per day has increased since I've been doing all the tips that people have been giving me about increasing it. My watch hours, I need 4,000. I have like a little over 400, but that increased by 20 hours yesterday. See, so I need 4,000 in 12 months. Now, right now, the days on the very beginning of the last 12 months have 0 watch hours. So when they fall off, it doesn't matter. And then the new ones are adding to it. So right now, I'm on track to hit 4,000 before possibly before this year, but before this 2025 is over. I hope so. Well, I'm at 42 minutes. I'm hoping I can upload this thing. Y'all take care. I'll see you tomorrow.